Hi guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the EVGA Z390 Dark's points of interest. Because unfortunately there's so much interesting stuff on this motherboard that if I tried to also talk about the VRMs in one video, it'd be like 50 minutes long. And I know that because I have a 50-minute take of everything on this motherboard. So instead, that's getting split into two pieces, and this part is going to be just everything kind of interesting on the motherboard, so let's get right into it, because either way, there's still a lot to cover.
Before that, this video is brought to you by the Corsair One i140 compact gaming PC. The Corsair One i140 is a small form factor PC outfitted with a 9700K, RTX 2080, 32GB of RAM, and a 480GB NVMe SSD, all housed within a 2mm thick aluminum chassis. The Corsair One i140 is a 12-liter system fit for desktop use, with the same sized i160 counterpart with higher-end parts. Learn more at the link in the description below.
The first thing that everybody obviously notices about this motherboard is that the DIMM slots are very few and in a rather odd location, being jammed up onto the top edge of the motherboard, right? Normally they're over here, but EVGA opted to rotate the CPU socket 90 degrees to get the DIMM slots up on the top edge. And there's two reasons for why they've opted to do this. One of them is that basically the team working on this motherboard are apparently a big fan of old DFI motherboards, and are big fans of old DFI motherboards, and DFI used to do motherboards where they would have the DIMM slots up on the top edge. So they basically decided that they wanted the Z390 Dark to be a visual throwback to the DFI motherboards that did that. And that's one of the reasons why the DIMM slots are located where they are. Now, there's also a practical, like, electrical reason for why they've put the DIMM slots up on the top edge. But unfortunately, because what separates, like, incredible extreme overclocking motherboards from great extreme overclocking motherboards and then horrible motherboards is not the actual, like, most of the time, it's not the CPU speeds you can achieve. It's all about the memory and essentially everything that happens in between the memory slots and the CPU, the CPU socket where the memory connects to the CPU. So basically, EVGA doesn't want to give me any information on anything happening in this area. And that includes the benefit, because there are practical reasons for why they've moved the DIMM slots up there. They just won't share them with me because, they fall into the category of super secret speed sauce for memory overclocking. So, yeah, that's rather unfortunate that, we don't know why this is beneficial, but I can totally, understand why EVGA doesn't want to share, because, again, this is really where, the board vendors can really differentiate themselves is with their memory layouts, and then what they also do in the BIOS for the memory training. Anyway, the other thing that, kind of stands out on this motherboard, not to me, because this is an extreme overclocking motherboard, and this is kind of standard for those now, but to a lot of people, it's the motherboard is $500, it's a high-end motherboard, and it only has 2 DIMM slots, and this is a very simple reason for this. So the Z390 Dark targets extreme overclocking, and more importantly, it targets, very high memory frequency capabilities. And by eliminating the extra DIMM slots, right, because you normally have 2 DIMM slots on each channel on most other motherboards, this one, you have only 1 DIMM slot per channel. By eliminating the extra DIMM slots, you actually, you reduce the distance that your memory signals have to travel from the DIMM slots to the CPU. And you reduce the DIMM slots themselves are actually add a whole bunch of parasitics to your memory traces, because your memory traces are actually shared between your DIMM slots on a given memory channel. So essentially what's going on with eliminating the DIMM slots is that EVGA is optimizing the memory layout for best possible overclock, for the best possible memory overclocking, and that's why it's on a 1 DIMM per channel configuration, which is standard for motherboards in this class. I mean, look at the Asus Apex series, the ASRock OC Formula series, some of the Gigabyte SoC motherboards, right? Like, all of these extreme overclocking motherboards, it's just, like, you don't go with 4 DIMMs, because it's bad for your maximum memory frequency capability. And as a side effect, also, it, impacts the best kind of timings you can run at a given frequency. So, yeah, EVGA has opted to go for just 1 DIMM on each channel. And that's pretty standard for a motherboard in this class. Now, where this differentiates itself further from other extreme overclocking motherboards is that these DIMM slots aren't any ordinary DIMM slots. Because if we look at the back of the board, you can clearly see that there's nothing coming through the PCB, because EVGA has opted to use surface mount memory slots instead of through-hole ones. And the surface mount ones are a bit more expensive, but that's not the main issue with them, and not really the reason why EVGA is using them. The reason why they're going for the surface mount memory slots is that these have, at least on paper, even lower parasitics than your conventional through-hole memory slots. So yeah, EVGA has opted to go for the SMD type here. Now, this is not unique to EVGA. Gigabyte has a couple of motherboards that also use these, but yeah, basically EVGA is just going, you know, all out with their memory overclocking capabilities in the sort of physical aspect of this motherboard. And actually, speaking of the physical aspect, you know, so we have the fact that the memory slots are in an odd location. There's very few of them. They're using SMT. EVGA also opted to go for a 10-layer PCB here to lay out the memory, like to lay out the entire motherboard with. Now, I'm not sure that they're actually necessarily making full use of that for the memory slots, but it basically does mean that they have a lot of room to lay out everything however they see necessary, right? And for comparison, most other high-end Z390 boards stop at 8 layers. So EVGA is just going, you know, 2 layers higher, so that just gives them that much more space to lay out anything they feel like laying out. Basically, they've gone to the absolute limit for optimizing the memory layout. I mean, like 10 layers is like X299 territory in terms of like PCB layers. And they're doing it for Z390. And if you're wondering, like, super high-end GPUs top out around 12. Okay, like you don't really see anything in consumer hardware with more than 12 layers of PCB, and here we have a motherboard with 10 of them, just to lay out 2 DIMM slots. So, as well as quite possibly a lot of the other features on the motherboard, but still, it is an added cost, and it does mean that EVGA can optimize this area of the board to ridiculous levels. So, anyway, sort of moving on from the physical aspects of the memory section right here. Well, there's actually rather fancy stuff going on the back of the board here as well, but they also told me not to talk about this either. So more secret speed sauce on the back of the board there. So yeah, anyway, one thing which is kind of standard for most extreme overclocking motherboards, but was missing is missing from a lot of EVGA motherboards until this one, is a controllable VTT DDR rail, which is kind of unfortunate because it really limits your overclocking capabilities on like past EVGA motherboards that aren't this. But here they have actually given us a controllable VTT DDR. So now they're using, so in the past they'd use like a LDO where the only way to configure the output voltage of that LDO was with like 2 resistors. On the new motherboards, well, actually even 1 resistor depending on what exactly you wanted, but on the Dark, they're using an LDO from UPI Semiconductor. It's a UP8815, and this is actually controllable with software. So you can now tweak your VTT DDR up and down, and this is very, very handy when you're pushing certain kits of Samsung B-Die. Actually, they're like, as I've also seen it be beneficial on other dies. It's just like, it's not quite like, nobody cares as much about those because they kind of suck. They don't clock as high, so you know, who cares? It doesn't go to 4000 CL12, then it doesn't matter. But basically the issue with VTT DDR is that the JDEC rule, or the JDEC rule for VTT DDR, is that you basically take your DIMM voltage, right? So, or VDDR or VDDQ, whichever you prefer to call it. Take your VDDR divided by 2, and that's your VTT DDR. This works great until your VDDR gets really high, like say 2 volts. At 2 volts VDDR, you get like 1 volt VTT DDR using the usual rule. The issue with that is there's a lot of memory kits out there where if you do that, they lose all stability, completely lose all stability. So you end up in a situation where you can keep raising the voltage, everything keeps improving, and then suddenly you get to a point where, yes, the frequency keeps getting higher, but the stability just doesn't improve anymore. And oftentimes it's because your VTT DDR is way too high for your specific memory kit. So at that point, it's normally you need to lock the VTT DDR to something around 0.95 volts. My own memory kits, for example, generally prefer about 0.935, right? Like, so between 0.93 and 0.94. So not even that 0.95. But basically, once you're at the optimum voltage for your memory sticks, then you can keep raising the VDDR. Like once you have optimum VTT DDR, you can keep raising the VDDR. So you can go up to like say 2.1 on your dim voltage and still have to maintain that VTT DDR to maintain stability. So yeah, this is actually a feature I requested that they add for the Z390 Dark, and I'm really happy to see that it's made it onto the board. But considering everything else they've done, you know, you shouldn't be surprised. I mean, they've gone all out for the memory overclocking capabilities, so this is kind of like a requirement at this point. So yeah, we have that. That's very nice to have. I'm a big fan of that. Very useful. Not useful for day-to-day users, but for extreme overclocking, it can really, well, it can help you eke out the last 100 to like 150 megahertz out of certain memory kits, maybe even more, but like that's what it does for like my kits. So then, moving on, next to the VTT DDR, we have the dual postcodes, which actually only one of these functions as a postcode, but the reason why we have four of these 7-segment well, 2 of these 7-segment display, whatever, two postcodes. We're just going to go with that because I can't figure out which way to say it correctly right now. It's early in the morning. So, the dual postcodes, so one of them acts as a postcode when you're posting just as normal, but they also integrate a whole bunch of monitoring functionality. So you can actually monitor temperatures and you can monitor voltage with these, which is pretty cool. So yeah, if you don't have like, you know, like they also give you voltage read points right here with the probit headers, which basically that's a header that plugs in, and then you get a whole bunch of basically like multimeter sockets coming off of that, which are actually really convenient because multimeter probes fit snug into that. So you can just like hook up your multimeter to the motherboard. You don't actually have to, you know, mess around with like voltage read points, how a lot of other motherboard vendors do them, where they give you like a solder bump and you need to stab the solder bump. And if they're really creative, they're going to put said solder bumps under like the 24 pin or something so that they're as hard to reach as possible. Well, no, EVGA has nice little headers that you can just plug into and your multimeter can be hooked up to the motherboard. But let's say you don't have, you know, a million multimeters, so you can't monitor everything. Well, you can put some of your voltages onto the postcode over here so that you can monitor them with this, and the multimeter can be monitoring something else. So it's a pretty nice feature as well. Obviously, the temperature monitoring is also convenient, as that means you can check your temperatures of the CPU without having any like monitoring utilities open, which is nice to do because monitoring utilities lower your benchmark scores. So you don't usually run any while benchmarking. So yeah, this is a pretty neat feature to have. Then we get some LEDs over here. This motherboard actually has a lot of LEDs, but none of them are RGB, and all of them are, in my opinion, infinitely more useful. So the 2 LEDs we get over here are dim initialization indicators, and these probably would be some of the less useful ones, especially for Z390. So I think these are like super useful on like X299 because X299 has memory controllers that have a tendency to drop memory channels. As in, you can boot up, and instead of initializing with, you know, you have 4 sticks plugged in because it's a 4-channel CPU, so one stick per channel, and it initializes, and you get 8 gigs of RAM instead of the 32 you were expecting. And the reasoning is the memory controller decides to drop half the memory sticks. Well, with these kinds of LED indicators, you can actually see that the memory training failed as soon as the memory training postcodes finish. So long before you even get into the operating system, you will know that there's like an issue with your memory initialization, which can save you a lot of time because you won't have to bother to go all the way into Windows to realize that you're missing half of your memory channels and your scores suck because there's missing memory channels. So yeah, the reason why I don't think it's going to be that useful on Z390 is that, as far as I'm aware, Z390 doesn't drop memory channels anywhere near as much. At least I've not seen it on either my 8086K or 9900K. You know, the CPU, the memory controller on these things either initializes both channels perfectly, or the whole thing doesn't start at all. So I'm not sure how useful that's going to be, but, you know, it definitely doesn't hurt anything. Next, we have the best button ever created. This is the Safe Boot button. For those of you who, like me, don't save your BIOS profiles regularly, so you do like 3 hours of tweaking, and then, you know, you screw up one setting and the system stops posting, and you haven't saved a single profile in those 3 hours, well, this button will save you from that kind of scenario, because you won't have to clear the CMOS when that happens. You can just hit the Safe Boot button, and it'll get you into the BIOS without having to wipe all of your settings. So all your settings will be still there, but it'll boot up on like safe defaults, and essentially, you know, save you from having to do a whole lot of work all over again. Now, for those of you who, like, in case the Safe Boot button doesn't work, there is still a clear CMOS. There's also a clear CMOS on the rear I/O, which personally I'd say I would have preferred a Safe Boot over there as well. Because the Safe Boot is so convenient that if I had, you know, if I committed the heresy that is installing this motherboard inside a case, I would honestly take off the side panel and get the Safe Boot button anyway if I screwed up while this was inside a case, because this is so convenient. So yeah, that's that right there. Next to that, we have the standard EVGA array of sort of voltage indicator LEDs. So basically these indicate that you just have, you know, various VRMs functioning. So it'll tell you like, oh yeah, VDDR is present, and VDDR is present, VCore is present, VCCSA is present, just that all of your voltages are actually, all of your VRMs are essentially firing up. I can see a situation, like if one of the VRMs dies, then this will obviously indicate that, hey, your VRM is dead, right? Because the LED will turn off. But, like, I think the usefulness of these will probably go up the older the motherboard is. So initially, I don't think well, initially you wouldn't necessarily need to use these much, because well, the VRMs on the board shouldn't have issues starting up. Like, that's kind of like not gonna happen unless you get like a dead on arrival board or something. So yeah, you know, they don't hurt anything, but I've never found a use for them myself yet. Though I can see how they would be handy, like if you have if the motherboard just becomes damaged in some way, then this will save you a lot of troubleshooting time. It's just that you shouldn't probably be breaking the motherboard in the first place, right? This is kind of one of those troubleshooting features where it's like, oh, you screwed up, let us help you. So it's still nice for that kind of scenario, but, you know, kind of limited use in that sense. Next, we have a USB header here, and this is for BIOS flashback, so you can actually flash the BIOS on this motherboard without even having a CPU installed. You just need standby power and a USB stick with the right format, and then file name, and then, you know, press some button. I didn't read through the full procedure for it, so I'm not sure what you actually have to press to get it to work. But yeah, you do have a BIOS flashback over there, so that's pretty neat. Then you have your power and reset, which is just completely standard for motherboards like this. And that kind of covers that area of the motherboard. Then we get the EVGA high-end motherboard standard of right angle. Actually, they've put these on more motherboards recently. Right angle power connectors. So 24 pin at a right angle, and they've recessed them into the motherboard because this thing is EATX, right? You can see how it goes way past the screw hole here. So yeah, this is EATX. This is basically to reduce the incompatibility with various cases that the EATX form factor runs into, and then, you know, putting the connectors at an angle like this further increases, because obviously if this 24 pin was over here, right, ending over here, then you'd have a connector that's sticking out to like there, and then you'd finally have the cables, and there's a lot of cases where your cable management hole would be like there, right, or here. So that won't work at all, and then you'll be forced to like run your 24 pins through like who the hell knows where. So yeah, essentially that's trying to reduce some of that. It does look very nice, like, you know, it is pleasing. It does also run into issues. It can run into issues with some cases. Ultimately, this motherboard is meant for a test bench, and if this is on a test bench, it does make it easier to see the postcode because there's no, you know, wires sticking up out of this area. And the buttons are all easier to reach because you don't have to reach over the 24 pin, which if it's sticking straight up is actually rather tall and obnoxious. So yeah, that's kind of that. So on a test bench, this really doesn't affect anything. Inside a case, it could cause some issues. Moving on, we're going to address these in the VRM video. Though I think if you've seen enough of my videos, you already know exactly what I'm going to say about those anyway. Board comes with triple BIOS. This is kind of standard for the dark motherboards from EVGA. So here's your triple BIOS switch. One of your BIOS chips is actually socketed. So if you really screw up and brick every single chip on the motherboard, you can actually just remove one of the chips and like ask EVGA to send you a replacement or use a hardware flasher to like flash it. You could also try flash them directly on the motherboard. That's just like more difficult for most people to do that's more difficult to do than if you can remove the chip. So yeah, one of the chips is socketed. There is triple BIOS. I'm a big, like, I think like if you have dual BIOS with a switch, that's already good enough in my book. But when you have triple BIOS, I mean, and it's socketed, it's just like, well, it's a bit better than dual BIOS. It certainly means that if you want to have like multiple different iterations of like the BIOSes, or there's like one BIOS which you found that works better for a certain scenario than another BIOS, you can have like, you know, as many BIOSes installed on the motherboard as you want at the same time. Well, assuming you only want 3. But I don't think anybody, like, I don't know why you'd want more than 2 at most times anyway, but you know, yeah, you can store more BIOSes on the motherboard at the same time, so you can basically go through like, oh, this BIOS is really good for this, doing this, and this BIOS is really good for something else. So you can keep them all on the motherboard instead of messing around with flashing every time you want to do a different, like, use the motherboard differently. So that's kind of nice to have here. And actually, I think multiple BIOSes for like an extreme overclocking motherboard should be a minimum requirement. Like, and I'm saying that because I recently realized my Maximus 11 Gene from Asus has no dual BIOS, which is just like, I have no idea what they were thinking. I guess BIOS chips also cost way too much for Asus, along with doublers as well. Anyway, moving on. Next to the triple BIOS, we find a PCIe on-off switch. PCIe in a on-off switch. Essentially, what that allows you to do is enable your PCIe slots and disable them, as well as M.2 devices. And the cool thing is, the idea behind this is if you have like water-cooled GPUs and one of them starts to malfunction, you can just disable it with the, you know, like it malfunctions in such a way that you can't even post with it present. You can actually just disable the PCIe slot it's in, and you don't have to worry about the GPU not working. So that's pretty cool. And also, to make sure that you don't forget which slots are enabled or disabled, EVGA actually has LEDs on the motherboard to indicate that the PCIe slots are, you know, active, and then actually also to indicate if the PCIe slot, like the device in the slot, is initializing properly. So again, I think this is, again, really, really cool. I've certainly, like, this is pretty standard for like extreme overclocking motherboards for a while to have this kind of feature, and I've used it a lot myself, and I gotta say that the LEDs are actually really, really helpful as well, because I have sometimes like installed GPUs and PCIe slots I previously disabled and then just forgot about it, and then was like, why is the GPU not starting? Like, what the hell is wrong, right? So yeah, you do have indicators for that being active, like for the PCIe slots being active or not. And that is on every single PCIe slot here, as well as the initialization of the device. So that's pretty cool. Next to that, we get another switch. This is slow mode. This is another one of those features I actually requested that they add, though admittedly, I think it would have been more useful on like X299 than on Z390. But the idea behind this switch is the slow mode switch. What it does, it forces the CPU into the lowest core ratio possible. So you can essentially, like, if you're on liquid nitrogen, right, you get into your operating system at like 6.5 gigahertz or 7 gigahertz or whatever frequency, and you need to like configure something so that you can run your benchmark. Well, you don't really want to be configuring Windows at 6 gigahertz or 6.5 gigahertz. That's a massive waste of power. because your power consumption is actually relatively linear with your frequency. So instead of running at 6 gigahertz, you know, on Windows desktop, you can just flick the slow mode switch. It'll put the CPU to like 8x or 12x. I'm not sure which it is on Z390. I think it's 8x. So you'll, instead of like 6 gigahertz plus, you'll be at like 800 megahertz, or basically around a gigahertz in frequency, which will cut down your power consumption very heavily, like quite significantly, which means you'll be wasting less liquid nitrogen while sitting on desktop, you know, while sitting on the desktop messing with settings. And the other benefit is obviously it reduces the likeliness of the system crashing when you're at, you know, 0.8 gigahertz. The other use is when you're like making your screenshot after finishing a benchmark, right? You can capture the screenshot, and then when you go to save it, you can hit the slow mode switch, because there's actually rules against making screenshots with slow mode enabled, because it makes it really hard to figure out what frequency you were running at. But after you have the screenshot and you're going to save it, you can actually put it into slow mode so that it doesn't crash while saving, because that tends to also happen when you're like really on the edge for some of the single core benchmarks out there. Yeah, saving a screenshot suddenly becomes a very difficult thing to do sometimes, and the slow mode switch can make it that much less difficult. So yeah, very nice feature to have as well. And then we get yet more extreme overclocking features. Also, there's LED indicators for the, is it the U.2? Yeah, it is the U.2 connectors over here. So, because they're, I assume, yeah, they're part of the PCIe, so there's LED indicators for that as well. But anyway, next we get legacy SATA over here. So the idea behind this is that there's a whole bunch of old benchmarks that run best on Windows XP. Unfortunately, Windows XP doesn't support modern Intel chipsets very well. So you run into this difficult situation where you can't like boot with Windows XP on most motherboards at all. So this right here is an ASMedia SATA 3 controller that is Windows XP compatible. There's also like a specific BIOS that the motherboard needs to be compatible with Windows XP. But basically the idea is you get the controller here for your SATA 3, you get the BIOS, and the motherboard is now Windows XP compatible, and you can run very old, you know, single core benchmarks in Windows XP, which is their preferred operating system. They just score way higher in that than they do in like Windows 10 or Windows 7. And that means that if you're using this motherboard, you know, if you're going for a benchmark like say SuperPi 32 million or 1 million, which is a benchmark that is like that's one of the benchmarks which really, really likes running on Windows XP. Well, if somebody's running 7 gigahertz and like the same memory settings as you, and you have Windows XP and they're on like Windows 7 or 10, you can probably beat them at like 6.9 or even lower, actually. You can probably beat them with even lower CPU clock speed. So that makes a big difference in some of those benchmarks. And obviously, if you match them on clock speed, you're just gonna, you can completely crush them, assuming your Windows XP configuration is on point. So yeah, you know, this is a very niche extreme overclocking feature, but it's definitely something that I'm sure a lot of people who are into SuperPi 32 million benchmarking will appreciate. I personally won't, because I can't be bothered with installing that many different operating systems and messing with that. But there are definitely people, you know, who spend a ton of time just running SuperPi 32 million, and for them, this is going to be very, very handy. So then moving along the bottom edge, we have some color-coded front panel headers, and they've actually kept these, you know, facing up so that it's easy to see what you're actually installing where. Moving along the edge, we also get a speaker here. So not only can you see the motherboard complaining, you can hear the motherboard complaining, or succeeding as well, because it'll beep when it finishes initialization pretty much based on how many USB devices you have plugged in. So that's also, well, you know, you can always disable it in the BIOS, so it's not like it actually hurts anything, and a lot of motherboards don't bother to include this, so it's kind of a nice, like, EVGA puts it everywhere, so it's kind of a nice, well, yeah, it's a nice feature to have, I guess. Personally, I don't really care. Well, I've actually found it rather useful in my own experience, because I can look away from the system while it's initialized, like posting, and not miss the BIOS coming up. Anyway, next we get a 6-pin power connector, and well, this is here for extra power to the PCIe slots. The reason why I don't think this is actually very useful in here is, like, NVIDIA doesn't support more than 2-way SLI. AMD doesn't support, like, with the Radeon 7, AMD isn't going to support more than 1 GPU at all. So, thing that this is solving is essentially that, like, the reason why this exists is that the 24-pin has a very limited amount of 12 volts power available in it, because there's only 2 pins in a 24-pin with 12 volts. And so what tends to happen is if you're running like a 3-way or 4-way GPU setup, and they pull a lot of power from the PCIe slot, you tend to melt the 24-pin 12-volt power connect, the 12-volt pins on a 24-pin. So that solves that, but the thing is, I don't think anybody's going to buy this motherboard and run a 3-way or 4-way setup in it anyway, because this last slot is X4. So even if you went with 1080 Ti's, you can't run SLI off of an X4 slot. NVIDIA doesn't let you. Well, I guess some people might, well, I could run like 3-way Crossfire on it, but it's less than ideal. So, like, this is solving an issue that this motherboard really shouldn't run into, but EVGA seems to like to put these 6-pins just about freaking everywhere. I mean, they've put them on, like, I have a micro ATX motherboard with 2 PCIe slots from EVGA with a 6-pin. Like, it's physically not possible to put more than 2 GPUs in it, and they still have the extra PCIe power. So I guess they're just really, like, they want to make absolutely certain that you have all of the PCIe slot power you could ever want and never need. Yeah, that pretty much covers it. This board does as far as extreme overclocking goes, it does everything. It's not a workstation motherboard, so it has limited, memory capacity support. It, like, the PCIe expansion options aren't what I would consider ideal, right? Again, there's no PLX chip on this because, as I said, right, you're going to run 2-way SLI at most, and if even that. And the thing with the PLX chips is if you don't actually plan to use a lot of PCIe devices at the same time, they do add a bit of latency to your PCIe communication. So if you're running just a single card or a dual card setup, not having a PLX chip is actually a good thing. If you need a bunch of PCIe connectivity, then, you're looking at like 3 GPUs, well, not necessarily 3 GPUs, but just a lot of PCIe devices in general. Well, then, the PLX chip becomes handy, but that's really, that's like a workstation scenario. And this motherboard won't go into a workstation. Like, you can't fit enough RAM in it already. Like, that alone is already probably going to be a problem for that kind of application. So, this is purpose built to max out extreme overclocks. And it goes super far to, like, it does everything to do that. And I'm a huge fan of that. I think this motherboard is absolutely incredible, but it is very focused in what it sets out to do, and the features really reflect that. So yeah, and I'm a big fan of it. I can't wait to try this motherboard out because the memory overclocking should be absolutely incredible on it. Yeah, so that's the feature set and points of interest on the Z390 Dark. We're going to cover the VRM separately, and I'll give you a teaser. They're awesome. Yeah, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support Gamers Nexus, there's store.gamersnexus.net for shirts and mugs and that kind of thing, as well as the actual mod mat that you can see in the background of the motherboard. And if you'd like to see more content from me, I have a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking where I do more overclocking things. So yeah, and you're very likely there's going to be a bunch of like Z390 Dark content going up sometime soon because I've recently got the board. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching and goodbye.